The grand courtroom loomed like an imposing monument to justice, its high ceilings adorned with intricate carvings, its polished wooden benches filled with a restless audience. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that electrified a room before a spectacle unfolded. The scent of aged paper and varnished oak mingled with the subtle yet unmistakable tension that had settled over the space. Reporters sat in the gallery, their pens poised over notepads, eyes flicking between the prosecution's table and the defense. Spectators, some eager for drama, others weighed down with quiet apprehension, leaned forward in their seats. Among them were a handful of Darren Cole's fellow officers, their presence a silent but deliberate statement of support. At the defense table sat Naomi Carter, her dark brown skin illuminated by the sterile courtroom lights. She was poised, unreadable, exuding a quiet strength that made it impossible to look at her and see guilt. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, she carried herself with the grace of someone who refused to shrink under pressure. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her fingers interlaced, her expression betraying no trace of anxiety. Yet, despite her outward calm, she was on trial for a crime she did not commit. The charge? Assaulting a police officer. Across the room, at the plaintiff's table, sat Officer Darren Cole. His uniform was pressed to perfection, the gold badge gleaming under the artificial lighting. He wore his confidence like armor, his smirk barely contained as he leaned back in his chair, watching the proceedings with the air of a man who had already won. His posture exuded arrogance, the kind that came from years of unchecked authority. The judge, Richard Grayson, entered, his robe billowing slightly as he settled into his chair. He was an older man, silver-haired and heavy, with the weariness of years spent presiding over cases that had tested his patience. He glanced over the courtroom, his sharp eyes landing briefly on Naomi before moving on. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. Judge Grayson shifted slightly in his seat and fixed his gaze on the plaintiff. "Prosecution, proceed." Cole rose, making a show of adjusting his uniform before stepping toward the witness stand. His movements were calculated, meant to project authority, to command the room's attention. As he took his oath and sat, he cast a fleeting glance at Naomi, his smirk barely faltering. "Officer Cole, please recount the events of the night in question," said the prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Richard Avery, whose sharp features and custom-tailored suit only reinforced the air of intimidation he carried. Cole nodded, clearing his throat. His voice was steady, confident, too confident. "On the evening of September 15th, I was patrolling the East Side District when I noticed the defendant, Naomi Carter, loitering outside a closed business. Given the hour and the nature of recent break-ins in the area, I approached her and asked what she was doing there. Naomi remained still, her expression neutral, but her mind cataloged every word, every inflection in his voice. When I asked for her identification, she immediately became hostile," Cole continued, his tone carrying an edge of righteous indignation. "She raised her voice, questioned my authority, and refused to cooperate. I attempted to de-escalate the situation, but she..." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the courtroom absorb the weight of his words. "Struck me in the chest and made a movement toward my service weapon." A ripple of murmurs coursed through the gallery. The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, as if the story made perfect sense. A black woman, alone at night, loitering, resisting, assaulting an officer. It was a narrative they had heard before, one designed to be believable. Naomi, however, did not react. She merely watched. At the defense table, Eric Lawson shuffled through his notes, his hands trembling slightly. His suit, though professional, lacked the polish of Avery's expensive tailoring. Fresh out of law school, this was the biggest case of his career, and he knew the odds were against them. Eric could feel the jury leaning toward Cole, their expressions serious, their skepticism aimed at Naomi, not at the officer testifying against her. He swallowed hard and glanced at his client, hoping to find reassurance in her face. Naomi, however, did not look at him. She was watching Cole, studying him with the precision of someone trained to assess body language. The small shift in his posture, the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly as he spoke. Most people wouldn't notice. Naomi did. Because Naomi Carter was not most people. Eric took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor, the defense is prepared to proceed with cross-examination." Judge Grayson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well. but let's keep it focused, Mr. Lawson." Naomi exhaled slowly. The real battle was about to begin. She had spent her life fighting wars overseas. Now, she was about to fight one in a courtroom. The silence in the courtroom thickened as Darren Cole settled into the witness stand. The officer exuded confidence, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He adjusted the microphone with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of knowing his word would be taken at face value. From the defense table, Naomi Carter remained perfectly still, her posture unwavering. She had been in high-stakes situations before, moments where survival depended on reading the smallest details. The flicker of uncertainty in an enemy's gaze, the tension in their stance before an attack. This, she knew, was no different. Cole glanced at the jury, offering them a solemn nod before turning to the prosecutor. Richard Avery, as calculated as ever, stepped forward, his tone firm but sympathetic. "Officer Cole," Avery began, "please walk us through the events of the night in question." Cole inhaled deeply, shifting slightly in his chair. His performance was flawless, a seasoned officer, weary but steadfast, simply recalling the truth. "I was on routine patrol on the east side of town when I noticed the defendant loitering outside a closed business," he began, his voice steady, authoritative. "Given the late hour and recent break-ins in the area, I approached to assess the situation." From the corner of her eye, Naomi caught the subtle movement of a jury member nodding slightly. The phrase "recent break-ins" was intentional, designed to create an immediate association between her and criminal activity. Cole continued, "I asked her for identification, as is standard procedure, and immediately she became defensive. She questioned why I was asking and refused to comply. Naomi kept her expression neutral, but internally she marked the first blatant lie. She raised her voice," Cole went on, letting just the right amount of exasperation seep into his words. "I tried to de-escalate the situation, but she was combative. It was clear to me that she was agitated, so I made the decision to detain her." He shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tightening on the wooden rail before him. "And that's when things escalated. The defendant struck me in the chest and made a move toward my firearm." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Naomi could feel the atmosphere shift, the weight of Cole's words sinking into the jury's minds. Assaulting an officer, reaching for his weapon. Exactly the kind of deadly accusation that got people killed. She inhaled slowly through her nose, keeping her breathing measured. A soldier's breath. A trained breath. At the defense table, Eric Lawson stiffened, his fingers gripping his pen a little too tightly. He knew this was bad. He could see it in the faces of the jurors, in the way their eyes flickered toward Naomi, with the kind of hesitation that whispered, "Maybe she's guilty after all." Cole leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with the jury as he continued. "At that point, I had no choice. I had to subdue her before she became a real threat. There it was, the ultimate justification. I restrained her as carefully as possible given the circumstances. But even while being detained, she remained uncooperative, belligerent." Eric shifted in his seat, mentally preparing for the moment he would have to stand and unravel this web of falsehoods. But how do you fight against a lie that people already want to believe? Naomi, meanwhile, did not move. She simply watched. Cole's left thumb tapped slightly against the rail in front of him. A tick. A tell. His shoulders tensed, just for a fraction of a second, before he forced them to relax. He was lying. The problem was, he was good at it. Naomi's gaze flickered to the jury. They were buying into his version of events, not all of them, but enough. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a whisper. "That doesn't sound right." It was barely audible, but the effect was immediate. Cole's jaw tensed slightly, his posture tightening just for a moment before he forced himself back into composure. He heard it, and so did Naomi. She turned her gaze ever so slightly toward the back of the room. She couldn't see who had spoken, but she didn't need to. It had begun. A ripple of uncertainty had entered the courtroom. Cole quickly continued, his voice a fraction sharper than before. "I did everything by the book. I used the minimal amount of force required to subdue the suspect." Naomi almost wanted to laugh. Minimal force? The bruises she had woken up with the next morning, the soreness that still lingered in her ribs, told a different story. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Thank you, Officer Cole. You may remain seated for cross-examination." Cole leaned back, exuding the air of a man who believed he had already won. He shot a glance at Naomi, the smugness in his eyes unmistakable. Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly, her lips pressing together in something that almost resembled amusement. Cole thought he was in control, but he had no idea what was coming. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Naomi Carter rose from her seat. The heavy air pressed down on the room, thick with the weight of expectation. All eyes were on her now. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to scrutiny, her steps measured as she made her way to the witness stand. For the first time since the trial began, she was in control of the room. As she took her seat, she adjusted the microphone with quiet precision. No wasted movements, no nervous tics. She was composed, controlled, ready. The judge, Richard Grayson, regarded her with careful interest before speaking. "Ms. Carter, you may proceed." Naomi inhaled evenly, then turned to face the jury. Not the prosecutor, not Cole, the jury. Because in the end, they were the ones who mattered. "Tell us, Ms. Carter, in your own words, what happened on the night of your arrest?" Naomi met the prosecutor's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I was walking home after visiting a friend. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk to check my phone for directions." Her voice was steady, without a hint of hesitation. The facts were simple, irrefutable. "I was standing on public property, not inside a closed business, not blocking traffic, simply existing." A few members of the jury shifted slightly in their seats, absorbing the subtle weight of her words. "Then," Naomi continued, "Officer Cole approached me. Her tone did not change, but the implication did. Cole had not responded to a crime, he had created one." The prosecutor, Richard Avery, took a step forward. His sharp eyes narrowed slightly, searching for a weakness. "And you're saying Officer Cole had no reason to stop you?" "I'm saying he had no lawful reason," Naomi corrected smoothly. Avery's lips pressed together in mild irritation. "Ms. Carter, Officer Cole testified that you were uncooperative and hostile." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I asked him why I was being stopped. That's not hostility, that's a question." A faint ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Naomi continued. "When I asked why I was being questioned, his tone changed. He demanded my ID but refused to tell me what I had done wrong. When I hesitated, because I was trying to understand my rights, he grabbed my arm." She let that statement sit. Cole, from his seat, stiffened. "He didn't escort me, as he claimed. He didn't guide me." Naomi's voice remained steady, but her words sharpened like a blade. "He grabbed me, hard." A few jurors exchanged glances. The prosecutor forced a smile. "Ms. Carter, if Officer Cole used force, isn't it possible he believed you were a threat?" Naomi held his gaze. "A threat? For standing on a sidewalk?" She let the silence stretch. "I wasn't shouting. I wasn't making a scene. I wasn't even moving. Yet, I was treated as a threat before I even had a chance to speak." She turned back toward the jury. "I know what that looks like. I know what it feels like. Because it's not the first time it's happened. Not just to me, but to people like me." The energy in the room shifted. Avery quickly pivoted. "Ms. Carter, you said Officer Cole twisted your words. Can you explain what you mean by that?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, after he grabbed me, I instinctively pulled back. That's when he said, 'Stop resisting.'" She paused, letting that phrase sink in. "3 words," she continued. "3 words that change everything. Because the moment an officer says those words, people stop questioning the situation. They assume guilt, assume threat. Even if the only resisting that happened was me trying to pull my own arm free." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of 2 jurors. Judge Grayson glanced at Avery, as if silently daring him to push further. The prosecutor tried. "Ms. Carter," he said, "Officer Cole has a different version of events. He claims you physically assaulted him. Do you have any proof that his account is false?" Naomi didn't blink. She simply leaned forward slightly, her hands resting gently on the wooden rail in front of her. Then, with the same calm, steady tone she had maintained throughout, she replied, "The truth will reveal itself soon enough." The room stilled. Cole shifted in his seat, his earlier arrogance beginning to show the first signs of cracking. Avery frowned. "That's not an answer, Ms. Carter." Naomi turned to face him, her eyes locked onto his. "It's the only answer you need for now." For For the first time since the trial began, it was the prosecutor who hesitated, because he wasn't sure if he had just won this exchange or lost it completely. The rhythmic hum of Eric Lawson's car engine was the only sound accompanying him as he navigated the quiet suburban streets toward Naomi Carter's home. The dim glow of streetlights flickered across the windshield, his mind racing through the events of the day. Something about Naomi's testimony had unsettled the courtroom, not because she seemed dishonest, but because she spoke with a confidence that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. That final phrase she had left lingering in the air, "The truth will reveal itself soon enough." Eric couldn't shake it. He had been her lawyer for months, and yet there was something about her he still didn't fully understand. Tonight, he was going to find out. Naomi's house was small but well kept, nestled near the outskirts of town, where the noise of the city faded into quiet. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow against the darkened street. Eric parked, stepped out, and took a steadying breath before making his way to the door. Before he could knock, the door opened. Naomi stood there, dressed in a navy sweatshirt and black leggings, a stark contrast to the composed professional figure she had been in court. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was unreadable. She didn't say anything. She simply stepped aside, letting him in. Eric entered cautiously, glancing around. The living room was neat, sparsely decorated, but everything had a purpose. A small bookshelf lined one wall, filled with books on leadership, strategy, and military history. A single-frame photograph sat on a nearby table. He moved closer, studying the image. It was a younger Naomi standing beside an older man, both dressed in military uniforms. Before he could ask, Naomi spoke. "That was my CO," she said, her voice steady. "The man who taught me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." Eric turned to face her. "Naomi, who are you?" She studied him for a moment before walking to a nearby cabinet. From inside, she pulled out a worn leather folder, placing it on the coffee table between them. "Open it," she said. Eric hesitated before carefully flipping it open. Inside were official military documents, commendations, service records, classified mission reports with large sections blacked out. At the top of one page, he saw it. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter, United States Navy SEAL. Eric's breath hitched. He looked up at her, stunned. You were a SEAL?" Naomi nodded. "For 20 years. Silence stretched between them. Eric felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. Everything, the prosecution's narrative, Cole's testimony, the way Naomi had watched the courtroom like she was studying a battlefield, suddenly made perfect sense. "Jesus," he breathed, running a hand through his hair. "This changes everything." Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. "Does it?" Eric blinked. "Of course it does. Naomi, they're trying to paint you as some untrained, unstable woman who lashed out at a cop. But this completely destroys their argument. You weren't a threat to Cole. If you wanted to take him down, you could have, easily." Naomi folded her arms. "Exactly, and that's the problem." Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" Naomi sat down across from him, her expression growing serious. "Think about it, Eric," she said. "What happens when this comes out? When people find out that I was a SEAL?" Eric hesitated. "They'll have to see you differently. They can't just dismiss you as some ordinary civilian." Naomi nodded. "Right, but they won't just see me as a veteran. They'll see me as a weapon, a trained fighter, a soldier. And some people, that'll make them even more likely to believe Cole's story." Eric's stomach twisted. She was right. Naomi leaned forward. "This case isn't just about proving my innocence, Eric. It's about exposing the system that lets men like Cole lie and get away with it. If I win, it's not just about me, it's about proving that no one is above accountability." Eric nodded slowly, his mind racing. "So that's why you've been holding back. You wanted to control how the truth comes out." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "I needed to make sure the moment was right. If I played this card too soon, it would have been twisted against me." Eric exhaled, leaning back. "Damn, this is bigger than I realized." Naomi studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "There's something else," she said. "Cole's not going to back down." Eric tensed. "What do you mean?" Naomi's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind her words. Men like him, men who thrive on control and power, they don't just admit when they're wrong, they double down, they get desperate. And when they get desperate, she let the sentence hang. Eric swallowed hard. They get dangerous, he finished for her. Naomi nodded. For the first time, Eric felt something he hadn't felt before in this case. Not just determination, not just pressure, fear, and the terrifying realization that this fight was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as court resumed. The weight of the previous day's testimony lingered in the air, thick with unspoken tension. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, though some exchanged brief glances, small but significant signs that their perception of the case was beginning to shift. Naomi Carter sat at the defense table, her expression composed as ever. But beneath the surface, she knew the battle was entering a critical stage. This was the moment when the truth would begin to break through. Eric Lawson straightened his tie, inhaling deeply before glancing toward the witness stand. Darren Cole was back. He walked with an air of forced confidence, but Naomi could see it. The tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. He wasn't as sure of himself as before, and that was dangerous. He had been cornered. Now he was about to fight back. Officer Cole, the prosecutor, Richard Avery, began as Cole settled into the stand. Can you clarify your previous testimony for the jury? Cole nodded, clearing his throat. His voice, though still steady, carried a slight edge of tension. As I previously stated, the defendant refused to comply when I asked for identification. She became aggressive, raising her voice. I had no choice but to take control of the situation. Eric watched him carefully. He was doubling down. And just to be clear, Avery continued, you maintain that the defendant struck you and attempted to reach for your weapon? Cole's fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the stand. Yes, he said. That is correct. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied, before turning toward the judge. No further questions at this time, Your Honor. Judge Grayson turned toward the defense. Mr. Lawson, your witness. Eric stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket before stepping toward the stand. His movements were measured, deliberate. He wanted Cole to feel the weight of what was coming. Officer Cole, Eric began, his voice steady. I'd like to go over your written report from the night of the arrest. Cole nodded. Of course. Eric picked up a copy of the police report and held it up for the jury to see. You wrote that you approached my client because she was loitering suspiciously outside a closed business. Correct. And you also stated that she was uncooperative when asked for identification. That's right. Eric paused, flipping to another page. But then, in this same report, you describe her demeanor as immediately hostile and erratic, suggesting that she was verbally aggressive from the moment you engaged with her. Cole shifted slightly in his seat. Yes. Eric raised an eyebrow. Which is interesting, he continued, pacing slightly, because earlier in this trial, you testified that it wasn't until you insisted on identification that she raised her voice. A brief silence stretched between them. Cole's jaw tensed. Which is it, officer? Eric asked, pausing just long enough for the question to sink in. Cole licked his lips. She became aggressive when I asked for ID. Eric nodded slowly. But that's not what's in your written report, is it? Cole hesitated. Maybe the wording isn't exact, but the situation was clear. Eric turned toward the jury, letting the tension in the room build. You're telling this court that a sworn police report, a document meant to be an accurate and truthful record, contains inconsistencies about when and how my client allegedly became aggressive? Cole clenched his jaw. It's not an inconsistency. The situation escalated. Eric didn't press further. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. The jury was paying attention now. They were beginning to see it. The cracks in Cole's story, the lies. But Eric wasn't finished. He returned to the defense table and retrieved a USB drive. He held it up. Your Honor, the defense has obtained additional evidence that is crucial to this case. A video recording taken by a bystander. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, the defense cannot introduce new evidence without prior submission. Judge Grayson eyed Eric sharply. Mr. Lawson? Eric remained calm. This video was only brought to our attention after Ms. Carter's testimony. It is critical to understanding what truly happened that night. The judge considered this for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. Proceed. The bailiff took the USB and inserted it into the courtroom's media system. The screen on the wall flickered to life. The footage was grainy, taken from behind the partial cover of a parked car. But the audio was clear. The courtroom fell into complete silence. It's Chaturji. The screen showed Cole grabbing Naomi's arm. Her voice was calm but firm. I haven't done anything wrong. Let go of my arm. Cole's voice followed, sharper than it had been in his testimony. Stop resisting. Naomi did not fight back. She did not lash out. But then, women like you need to learn how to listen. The words rang through the courtroom. The impact was instantaneous. Gasps erupted in the gallery. A murmur of shock spread through the jury. At the prosecution's table, Richard Avery's face paled. And at the witness stand, Darren Cole froze. His confidence, so carefully maintained, fractured. Judge Grayson banged his gavel sharply. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. But the damage was done. The video ended, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. For the first time since the trial had started, Darren Cole looked afraid. Naomi sat back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She turned to Eric. Now, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Watch how fast that wall crumbles. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer charged with the quiet acceptance of Darren Cole's authority. No longer weighed down by the expectation that his version of events was the truth. No, now there was doubt. That bystander's video had done something no amount of questioning could. It exposed him, and Cole knew it. He sat at the witness stand, his normally composed expression tight with barely concealed panic. His hands clenched around the armrests, his jaw working as if he were struggling to contain his frustration. From the prosecution's table, Richard Avery shifted uncomfortably, his once airtight case unraveling before his eyes. Judge Richard Grayson let out a heavy sigh and turned toward Cole. Officer Cole, he said, his voice measured, do you have an explanation for what we just heard? Cole straightened in his seat, but Naomi could see it. The way his right foot tapped slightly against the floor, the way his fingers twitched. Tells. Signs of a man trying to think faster than his lies could hold up. Your Honor, Cole began, forcing his voice into something calm, authoritative. What you heard in that video was taken out of context. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Out of context? Eric Lawson leaned back slightly, his lips pressing together in something that wasn't quite a smile. Cole was scrambling. Out of context? Eric echoed, standing and approaching the stand with deliberate slowness. Please, enlighten us, officer. In what possible context does telling a black woman, women like you need to learn how to listen, sound appropriate? Cole bristled. I was trying to de-escalate the situation, he said, his voice sharper than before. She was being uncooperative, and I was making it clear that compliance would have avoided what? Eric interrupted smoothly. Being shoved against a police car, being arrested without cause, being falsely accused of reaching for your weapon? Cole's mouth opened and closed. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. She didn't need to. The jury was seeing it. Everyone was seeing it. Eric turned back to his table, flipping through a file before pulling out a printed report. Now, Officer Cole, let's talk about another interesting coincidence, he said, his voice casual, almost amused. Your body camera. You filed an official statement that your body camera malfunctioned at the exact moment of this arrest. Is that correct? Cole shifted in his seat. That's right, these things happen. Eric raised his eyebrows. Do they? He flipped to another page. Because in the past 3 years, you've logged over 24 body camera malfunctions. Is that another coincidence? The gallery gasped. Cole's face went pale. Objection! Avery shot up. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Overruled, Judge Grayson said immediately. I'd like to hear his answer. Cole's eyes flickered toward Avery, silent pleading in his expression. But Avery looked away. Cole was on his own now. Eric took a step closer, his voice softer now, deadly calm. You claim Naomi Carter was a threat. You claim she resisted arrest. But what that video showed us was very different, Officer Cole. What that video showed was a woman standing still while you grabbed her, while you escalated. Cole set his jaw. You lied. A hush fell over the room. You lied under oath. You lied on your police report, and now, because you got caught, you want us to believe that it was all a misunderstanding. Cole gritted his teeth. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Eric shot back. A heavy silence stretched between them. For the first time, Darren Cole had no answer. The jury had changed. Naomi saw it clearly. The way their eyes lingered on Cole, suspicion creeping in. For so long, they had been inclined to believe him. He was the officer, the authority. But now they weren't so sure. She could feel the momentum shifting, the first fractures in the wall that Cole had built around his lies. But fractures weren't enough. They needed undeniable proof. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple before looking at Cole. You may step down, he said. Cole stood stiffly, his shoulders tight, his face flushed. He didn't meet anyone's eyes as he walked back to his seat. Naomi watched him carefully. He was angry. No, he was cornered. And a man like Cole, when cornered, became reckless. Judge Grayson looked at the clock. We will break for recess, he announced. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The gavel struck and the room burst into whispers. Eric immediately turned to Naomi, his voice low. We have them on the ropes, but it's not enough. Naomi nodded. She already knew. That video hurt him, Eric continued, but he's still got room to squirm. If we want to end this, we need something more. Naomi's gaze flickered toward the prosecution's table, where Cole was whispering furiously to Avery. They're going to hit back, she said softly. Eric followed her gaze, then sighed. Yeah, he muttered. I just hope we hit harder. Naomi stood, smoothing her blazer as they prepared to leave the courtroom. Eric hesitated before speaking. You were right, he said finally. Men like Cole? They don't back down easily. Naomi turned to him, her expression unreadable. He's not going to back down, Eric. She glanced toward Cole one last time before heading toward the door. He's going to come out swinging. The courtroom was still humming with tension when the recess ended. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Officer Darren Cole sat at the plaintiff's table, his usual confidence barely holding together. His eyes flickered between the judge, the jury, and his own attorney, Richard Avery, who was whispering something urgently to him. For the first time since the trial began, Cole looked alone. Naomi Carter remained composed at the defense table, watching him the way a soldier watches an opponent who has just realized they're losing. She could feel it. The walls around his lies were starting to crumble. Now, they just needed the final blow. Judge Richard Grayson entered and took his seat, tapping his gavel twice. Mr. Lawson, he said, turning to the defense. You may proceed. Eric stood confidently, holding a thick folder in his hands. His expression was unreadable, but Naomi could see the spark of certainty in his eyes. He knew what he had. He turned toward the jury, letting the tension settle before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Eric began, his voice calm, measured. Over the past few days, you have heard Officer Cole's account of what happened the night of my client's arrest. He paced slightly, letting his words sink in. You've heard how he described my client as aggressive, as hostile, as a threat. You've heard his claims that he used only the force necessary to protect himself and uphold the law. Eric stopped, turned, and lifted the folder slightly. But what if I told you this wasn't the first time Officer Cole has told this story? A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Cole tensed. Avery immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. We have not been given prior notice of this so-called evidence. Eric turned to the judge, unfazed. Your Honor, the prosecution had every opportunity to disclose Officer Cole's internal records. They chose not to. But these records are critical to establishing a pattern of behavior that speaks directly to his credibility. Judge Grayson folded his hands, studying Eric carefully. Proceed with caution, Mr. Lawson. Eric nodded, then walked to the bailiff, handing over the folder of documents. The bailiff delivered copies to the jury and the judge. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the jury members began reading. It took only seconds for the expressions on their faces to shift. Shock, uncertainty, disgust. Eric turned back to Cole. Officer Cole, he said, flipping to a highlighted section of the file, are you aware that in the past 5 years, you have had 12 separate complaints filed against you for excessive force? Cole's fingers twitched against the table. Objection, Avery shouted. These are unproven complaints. They were never substantiated. Eric turned to the judge. Your Honor, it is important for the jury to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. Officer Cole has a documented history of using excessive force, especially against people of color. Avery was fuming. This is character assassination. Judge Grayson lifted a hand. Overruled, he said. The jury will consider the relevance of this information. Avery sat down stiffly, his jaw tight. Cole stared straight ahead, his face blank. But Naomi could see it, the first sign of real fear. Eric continued. Let's talk about a particular complaint, he said, flipping to another page. 3 years ago, a young black man named Jamal Rivers accused you of slamming him against a patrol car during a routine traffic stop. Does that sound familiar? Cole's jaw clenched. That complaint was dismissed, he said flatly. Yes, Eric agreed, because there was no body camera footage to support Jamal's claim, just like in Naomi Carter's case. The gallery whispered among themselves. Eric flipped another page. 2 years ago, a Latina woman named Mariana Diaz accused you of shoving her onto the pavement after she asked why she was being detained. That's not relevant, Cole snapped. Not relevant? Eric shot back. Because, once again, there was no body camera footage, another malfunction, another coincidence. Cole's face darkened. This is an attack, he hissed. This has nothing to do with the case. Eric smiled slightly. Oh, but it does, he said. Because we're seeing a pattern, Officer Cole, a pattern of behavior, a pattern of force, a pattern of lies. The jury kept reading, more complaints, more patterns, more evidence that Cole had done this exact thing before, many times. At the back of the courtroom, Naomi noticed something subtle. The police officers who had been supporting Cole, they were stiff now, avoiding eye contact. One of them, a younger officer with a buzz cut, leaned toward another and whispered something. The other officer nodded. They weren't defending him anymore. They were distancing themselves. Cole noticed too. His face turned red, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was losing them, losing everything. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Officer Cole, he said, his voice heavy. Do you have anything to say regarding these records? Cole's fingers curled into fists. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, they were all lying. His voice was hoarse, desperate. They all made false claims, he insisted. None of it was true. Eric raised an eyebrow. Every single one of them, he asked, tilting his head slightly. All 12 complaints? All different people? Over multiple years? Cole opened his mouth, but no words came. Silence. The jury saw it. They weren't looking at him like a respected officer anymore. They were looking at him like a liar, like a man who had been caught, like a criminal. Naomi exhaled silently. This was it. The truth was finally taking hold. She met Eric's gaze, and he gave her a small nod. They were winning. The courtroom was silent as Naomi Carter rose from her seat. This time, when she walked toward the witness stand, there was no doubt about who held control. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had walked into hostile territory before, a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. But this time, the enemy wasn't an armed opponent. It was a lie that had festered in the justice system for too long, a lie that had nearly crushed her beneath its weight. And today, she would destroy it. Naomi settled into the witness chair, adjusting the microphone in front of her. The wooden seat beneath her felt cold, but she barely noticed. She exhaled slowly, then looked directly at the jury. Eric Lawson stood beside her, his posture strong, confident. They had planned this moment carefully. Ms. Carter, he began, his voice calm but commanding. For the record, please state your full name and background for the court. Naomi didn't blink. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter, United States Navy SEAL, retired. The courtroom gasped. The jury's reaction was immediate. Several members sat forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. At the plaintiff's table, Darren Cole tensed. Eric let the silence linger, letting the weight of Naomi's words settle into the air. Then, he continued. Lieutenant Commander Carter, he said, emphasizing her title, can you describe your years of service? Naomi nodded. I served in the United States Navy for 20 years, she said evenly. 15 of those years were spent in special operations. I was deployed in multiple combat zones, led missions requiring high-level strategy and discipline, and trained extensively in de-escalation tactics, hostage negotiation, and hand-to-hand combat. More murmurs rippled through the gallery. Eric paced slightly, turning toward the jury. "You've heard Officer Cole testify that my client was aggressive, violent, and uncontrollable," he said. "You've heard him claim that she was a threat. Now, let me ask you this." He turned back to Naomi. "As a highly trained SEAL, if you had actually wanted to harm Officer Cole that night, could you have done it?" Naomi's expression remained unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. Another gasp. "But did you?" Eric pressed. "No," she answered, "because I wasn't a threat." She turned toward the jury. "People assume that because I was trained in combat, that makes me dangerous, but my training taught me something more important than how to fight." She let her gaze sweep over the room. "It taught me when not to fight." A hush fell over the room. "My training taught me how to assess threats," she continued, "how to defuse tense situations, how to neutralize hostility without resorting to violence. I've been in real life or death encounters where every decision could mean survival or failure, and I've never reacted with force unless absolutely necessary." She turned toward Cole now, her first direct acknowledgement of him since she took the stand. "But you wouldn't know that, would you?" she asked, her voice calm, unwavering. Cole stiffened. "You didn't bother to ask who I was that night," she said, her voice controlled but cutting. "You saw a black woman standing on a sidewalk, and that was enough. Enough for you to assume guilt, enough for you to escalate, enough for you to lie." Cole's fingers curled around the armrests of his chair. "You underestimated me, Officer Cole," Naomi said. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. She simply let the truth land like a sharp, clean blade. "And more importantly," she continued, "you underestimated the power of the truth." Cole was sweating now. He avoided her gaze, staring down at the table. His usual smugness had evaporated, leaving behind only the remnants of a man who had spent too long believing he was untouchable. Eric turned back to Naomi. "One final question," he said. "Did you, at any point, resist arrest or attempt to take Officer Cole's weapon?" "No," Naomi said clearly. "And do you believe Officer Cole used unnecessary force against you?" "Yes." She turned toward the jury one last time. "I fought for this country," she said, her voice steady. "I fought for justice, and now I'm fighting for the truth, not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been silenced by those in power." The courtroom was dead silent. No murmurs, no whispers, just the weight of the truth settling in. Judge Grayson leaned forward. His gavel hovered over his desk, but he didn't strike it yet. Instead, he studied Naomi for a long moment, then looked toward the jury. "Mr. Lawson," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "No further questions, Your Honor," Eric said. Naomi stepped down from the stand, her head held high. She returned to her seat beside Eric and exhaled slowly. For the first time since the trial began, she knew. They had won. The courtroom was charged with an energy that was nearly unbearable. The battle had been fought. Now came the reckoning. Judge Richard Grayson shifted in his seat, glancing toward Richard Avery, the prosecution's lead attorney. His once confident posture had eroded over the course of the trial, his shoulders tighter, his jaw clenched. He knew what was coming. Everyone did. Still, he had to try. The prosecution's closing argument. Avery stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket, then turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carefully measured, "you have heard a compelling case. The defense has presented an admirable effort to challenge the events of that night. But I urge you to remember what is truly at stake." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the 12 jurors. "Law enforcement officers make difficult split-second decisions every day," he said. "They put their lives on the line to keep us safe. And Officer Cole, regardless of the accusations against him, was simply trying to do his job." A few jurors exchanged glances, but their expressions were far from convinced. Avery could see it. His control over the narrative was gone. He pressed on, his voice rising slightly. "The defense wants you to focus on Officer Cole's past. They want to paint him as a villain. But I ask you, are we truly here to judge an entire career based on one single encounter?" The statement hung in the air. For a moment, no one reacted. Avery sighed, adjusting his tie. He had nothing left. This case is not about politics. It's not about the past. It is about the law. And the law states that resisting arrest is a crime. Officer Cole followed procedure. That is what I ask you to remember when you deliberate. He exhaled, then gave a stiff nod. Thank you. He turned and returned to his seat, avoiding Cole's gaze. The defense's closing argument. Eric stood with confidence. He wasn't nervous anymore. Not after everything they had exposed. Not after Naomi had stood on that witness stand and obliterated every lie that had been told about her. He stepped toward the jury, meeting their gazes one by one. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. You have been asked to make a choice between the truth and a carefully constructed lie. He gestured toward Naomi, who sat with her hands folded, steady and unshaken. This is Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter, he said, a woman who has dedicated her life to serving this country, a woman who has faced real threats, who is trained in de-escalation tactics, who has spent years protecting the freedoms we all hold dear. His voice hardened. And yet, we are expected to believe that on one random night, she suddenly abandoned all of that training, all of that discipline, to recklessly attack a police officer? He turned to the jury, letting the absurdity of the claim sink in. This is not about a split-second decision. This is about abuse of power, about an officer who saw a black woman standing alone and decided that was enough reason to assert his authority. Eric paused, his gaze sweeping across the jury. You heard the video. You saw the internal records. You listened to the inconsistencies in Officer Cole's testimony. He turned slightly, this time looking directly at Cole. You saw him lie. Cole's face went rigid. Eric turned back to the jury, his voice lowering slightly. This case is not just about Naomi Carter. This case is about something bigger. It is about what happens when we allow men like Officer Cole to go unchecked. When we let authority be abused, when we allow the truth to be buried beneath a uniform. A beat of silence passed. Then, his final words. You were the last line of defense against that kind of injustice. And today, you have the power to stop it. He stepped back. No further statements, Your Honor. The deliberation. Naomi sat in the courthouse hallway, hands clasped lightly in her lap. The jury had been gone for hours. Eric paced nearby, rubbing the back of his neck, his expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke, because now there was nothing left to say. Naomi exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. She had spent her life fighting battles, some on the ground, some in the shadows. But this fight for her own truth, her own dignity, had been unlike anything else. And soon, she would know if it had been enough. The verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Naomi rose, standing beside Eric. Across the room, Darren Cole sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Judge Grayson looked toward the jury. Madam Foreperson, he said, has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged woman with kind but serious eyes stood, holding a folded piece of paper. Yes, Your Honor. She unfolded it, took a breath, and read. In the case of State versus Naomi Carter, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty on all charges. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the gallery erupted. Eric exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping in relief. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of those words settle deep inside her. Not guilty. She was free. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Order in the court, the jury foreperson continued. Furthermore, she said louder now, we, the jury, strongly recommend an official investigation into Officer Darren Cole's misconduct. Cole visibly stiffened. For the first time, the color drained from his face. Judge Grayson turned to him. His voice was calm but firm. Officer Cole, he said, I strongly advise you to retain counsel. This matter is far from over. Cole said nothing. He simply sat there, staring forward, his career collapsing around him. Outside the courthouse, Naomi stepped out into the sunlight. A crowd had gathered, reporters, cameras, spectators. Everyone wanted to hear her speak. She took a slow breath, then turned to face them. This isn't just my victory, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. This is a victory for accountability, for justice, for everyone who has ever been silenced by those in power. She met the eyes of the reporters, the bystanders, the people who had followed this case from the beginning. "I didn't fight this battle alone," she said, "and I won't stop fighting for others." The crowd erupted into applause, but Naomi wasn't listening. She was already walking away, because she had won today. But the fight wasn't over yet. The cameras flashed like bursts of lightning, illuminating Naomi Carter's face as she stood on the courthouse steps. She had just won her freedom, but she knew this moment was bigger than her. The crowd had swelled, journalists, activists, and everyday people who had followed her case, all waiting for her to speak. Eric Lawson stood a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, watching the scene unfold. He knew Naomi wasn't just another acquitted defendant walking free. She had become something else entirely, a symbol of resistance, of accountability, of truth finally breaking through. Naomi stepped forward. The world was watching. She exhaled and then spoke, her voice steady and resolute. "This isn't just about me." The crowd hushed. "This is about holding those in power accountable." Her words rippled through the mass of people. This was more than a personal victory. It was a public reckoning. Naomi lifted her chin. "For too long, people like me, black, strong, unafraid to speak, have been treated as threats, not citizens. For too long, those who abuse their authority have walked away with impunity. Today, that changed. And I promise you, this fight is far from over." A roar of applause erupted from the crowd. Camera crews pushed forward, trying to capture her expression. The flashes reflected in her dark eyes, but she didn't blink. She had faced worse. She had faced men with weapons, with power, with fear in their eyes and a finger on a trigger. A press conference was nothing in comparison. A nation reacts. The case dominated the news for weeks. Talk shows, headlines, online forums, everywhere, people were talking. Some called her a hero. Others debated the deeper implications of her trial. Was this the beginning of real accountability? How many other officers had hidden behind the same lies Cole had told? Naomi saw the news reports. She saw the conversations happening in places where, before, there had only been silence. And that was a win. The fall of Darren Cole. Months later, the inevitable happened. The internal investigation into Darren Cole's misconduct found overwhelming evidence of corruption. The complaints Eric had presented in court were just the beginning. More victims came forward. More cases resurfaced. In the end, the department had no choice. Darren Cole was dismissed from the police force. Shortly after, he was charged with perjury and misconduct. The same system that had once protected him turned its back on him. And Naomi? She didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She had always known the truth would catch up to him. Returning to life, but not the same life. Naomi stepped onto the porch of her quiet home one morning, taking in the fresh air. She had spent years in war zones, years watching over her shoulder, years training for battles she couldn't afford to lose. Now, her fight looked different. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't carrying a weapon. But she was still a warrior. One afternoon, Eric called her. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "I half expected you to be on TV every night after the verdict." Naomi chuckled. "I didn't do this for attention, Eric." "Yeah," Eric said, "but whether you wanted it or not, you became something bigger than just this case." Naomi knew he was right. She had received letters, emails, messages from people all over the country. Some told her their own stories of injustice. Others just thanked her for proving that not every fight was hopeless. "People are looking to you now," Eric continued. "They want to know what's next." Naomi looked out over the horizon. What was next? She had fought battles her entire life. Maybe it was time to start winning wars. She smiled. "I'll figure it out," she said. "But for now, I'm just taking a breath." Eric chuckled. "Just don't breathe too long. The world needs people like you." Naomi hung up, her mind already moving forward. The fight was never really over, but now she was stronger than ever, and she was ready.